Hello, this is just a bit of a ramble to try and help get my own thoughts in order because I've got nobody else to talk to at the moment except the dog, and he wasn't interested. Um, to reflect on a few theological issues that I'm trying to get my mind around. I have spoken about some of these issues years and years ago in a recording. Um, I don't know if I've wildly changed my points of view on these matters since then, but thinking of that, oh no, I should say the hat, if anyone's wondering. It's not just to cover up the bald spot, it's also because it's very cold in here. And I'm far too mean to turn on the heating given the extortionate rates being charged by certain profiteering electric companies. There's a whole other issue in itself. What got me thinking was Blaise Pascal's notion. I say Blaise Pascal's. It's He was a philosopher, by the way, if anyone's unfamiliar. He's often attributed as one of the first people to start formulating these ideas, although there had been a fair number of people before then who'd sort of sketched around these concepts and notions. Although he doesn't use the phrase God-shaped hole himself, it's often sort of tracked back to him as something he expressed in a variant manner. And this notion of a God-shaped hole, it's something that Jung and a variety of other people discussed over the centuries, is whether or not there is a sort of a hole, a gap, a void, or call it what you will, within the human psyche into which figures of divinity slot. The idea being partly that throughout human history, no matter what country you go to around the world, no matter what culture you look at, whether a modern day culture or an ancient culture from 20,000 years ago, religion appears again and again and again and again in one form or another. And there's probably 1,000 plus different religions that have manifested around human cultures over the centuries across the globe. And pretty much all of those religions have had some notion of a god, a goddess, a whole pantheon of them, of mysterious beings that are out there. And so philosophers and psychologists and various other people have sat down and wondered, is this something we can just dismiss and wash off with some quasi-sociological theory that just suggests it's all power structures and hierarchies and means of oppressing people and controlling them, which is kind of the usual left-wing, slightly Marxist bleat against the notion of religion, going back to Marx's palaver about religion being the opiate of the masses, the painkiller of the masses. Is it just that, or is this a recognition that there is something in the human psyche that craves the metaphysical, that craves the mysterious, the transcendent, that craves the notion of there being at least one, if not multiple beings out there that are bigger, grander, greater, if not full on eternal, at least compared to a human lifespan as close as makes no never mind. Is there an urge, a hole, a void, this craving within the psyche to have contact with something? Now that's not absolutely the same thing as saying there definitely is something to have contact with. Just because you've got a craving for something that doesn't prove that the something in question exists. But it's certainly suggestive that there is this yearning for something transcendent, whether you understand that as Christ or Allah or Zeus or Gaia or Kununos or whoever, that there is something out there that we wish to have contact with. A Freudian, no doubt, might track it back to infant experiences of the parents as these sort of huge, great giants that come into the world and provide us with food and sustenance and cuddles and warmth and everything else, and it's a yearning for something parental, which obviously does, although there's quite a lot I disagree with in Freud, I can certainly see the idea he's coming from there, in that a great many religions use familial terms when describing their deities. They talk of father god or mother goddess or grandfather this or uncle that. They're sort of familial attributes placed upon the divine to give it this more intelligible quality, and that is perhaps partially a reflection of this sort of infantile urges towards family bonding, or I say infantile, childlike urges towards family bonding. But also, of course, if you're talking about a being so vastly removed from direct human experience, to use one of my favourite words of the moment, ineffable. I've been watching Good Omens again. You try to make it a bit more effable, as it were, a bit more describable, something you can put into human terms by attributing human traits to something that is vastly beyond human, because your mind needs some kind of handle to get a grasp on what it is that you're talking about, particularly if you're trying to explain a complex and nebulous emotional state, a spiritual state, to somebody who hasn't experienced it. You've got to put it into words that make sense to the both of you. And so we tend to turn towards that. Now, in thinking about this God-shaped whole, obviously Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, other monotheists tend to think of this as a singular entity, a singular whole for a singular God. As a polytheist, I'm thinking in the plurality. Now, does that mean that we have more holes in our psyche than a Swiss cheese, and that Aphrodite slots into one hole, and Hera into another, and Apollo into a third? Not necessarily, because there could, in a sense, be a yearning, and that yearning could be met by a concept of a singular deity, or it equally could be met by a concept of 5, 6, 10, 100, 1,000 deities. The yearning perhaps remains the same regardless of how you comprehend the presences that fit into that yearning. And I'd go a little bit further, reflecting on some of Max Weber's ideas, who was a German sociologist who studied religion, which is why I'm thinking about him in this context. He had a notion of the divine, of religion, and the way in which God, he was again thinking mainly in a monotheist context, is described by various different religions as reflective of the value set being promoted by that particular culture. So if one community thinks of God as this very sort of stern, judgmental father who punishes people and sends them to hell if they do wrong, then that reflects the very kind of stern values that community has, and that if anyone in that community steps out of line, they get dealt with very, very severely, and rather grim punishments are inflicted upon them. And equally, some other community a few hundred miles up the road might think of God in very loving, caring, nurturing terms. Christians might speak of gentle Jesus, meek and mild. And again, Weber would suggest that reflects that the community values care and nurture and those gentler traits, would seek to treat its members in that more gentle fashion. I don't know that always pans out in reality. The Victorians were quite fond in their hymns and so on of talking about gentle Jesus, meek and mild. But it wasn't exactly the most caring, nurturing of cultures going. They were, in many respects, quite harsh and judgmental towards each other. So it doesn't always pan out. But it's an interesting notion, this sense of a community having certain values at the top. Now, whether you take a bit of a chicken or egg argument, take the idea that they have these values, therefore they decide to interpret the divine in the light of their own pre-existing values, or if you take the notion that they have experiences of the divine and the values that they perceive as part and parcel of the divine become the values that reach the pinnacle of that civilization and are lauded as the highest. Which comes first, the experience of divinity or the set of cultural values? You can argue that one till you're blue in the face. An atheist presumably would argue that the cultural values come first, and the stories of divinity are exactly that, stories of a fictionalized being that reflects the pre-existing values of the culture, whereas somebody who embraces the nature of the notion rather of divinity would argue perhaps that it's the touch of the divine that brushes against that culture and then leads them to think of certain values as more significant than others. Which itself reminded me of donkeys years ago when I used to teach medical ethics. Two of the big names in medical ethics in terms of philosophers and people who write books about it and so on are Beecham and Childress. And they argue for a set of 4 main medical values. There's additional arguments from elsewhere about 5th and 6th values, but the 4 main values that they proposed in their first few books. And I won't go into them because that's medical ethics and that's a separate thing, and I'm sure 8 years ago I did make a few recordings about medical ethics anyway. What they don't do is put the 4 set of values, things like do no harm and the autonomy of the patient and so on, what they don't do is put them in a hierarchy. So you've got these 4 values, and a doctor, a nurse, a dentist, a psychiatrist, a medical person of some description, professional, could easily find themselves, and other people have written books about this very issue, find themselves in a situation where they're trying to help a patient, and if they do action A, it uplifts one of the 4 virtues, but if they do action B, it uplifts a different one of the 4 virtues, and there is no action they can do that will uplift both or 3 or all 4 of the virtues at the same time. So the virtues in certain real life situations come into conflict. You can do one thing or the other, but you can't do both. And because they don't put them in a hierarchy, Beecham and Childress in their books, it leaves medical professionals with this difficult to resolve issue as to, if you've got to choose between value A, value B, value C, value D, because you can't do all of them at the same time in this particular real life situation, which one takes precedence? That doesn't happen. And it's a critique I've heard various people making of polytheism, within monotheism, which tends to be the favoured approach of the people making these critiques. You've got one God and therefore, arguably, one set of values, a singularity of values. Therefore, there is something that always takes precedence, whereas if you've got 50 gods, 100 gods, or however many, and each one is embodying a different notion, a different value, promoting a different approach to life, which one takes precedence? Which for them is a bit of an insoluble argument. You could allow for henotheism, this notion that there are many cultures around the world in which people that do or did in the past believe in lots and lots of deities, but they had their own personal one whom they had a primary relationship with, which could be the deity their family traditionally worshipped, or their village, their tribe, or it could be more of a sort of an established one-to-one thing where, perhaps connected to their profession, they were a blacksmith, so they worshipped the god of the blacksmiths. They were a farmer, therefore they worshipped the goddess of the earth, that sort of thing. But however it came about, they had a particular deity who was their primary connection to the metaphysical, but they were aware of and believed in all of these other ones as well. So you could argue there is a matter of precedence, if we're going down this Weberian line, that deities connect to sets of values and sets of virtues that within a henotheistic context you might say, yes, there's 300 deities and they represent this set of values, but my personal primary allegiance, my patron or matron is so-and-so over there, and their set of values is this. So in my life, these are the values that take precedence over all of the others. But I'm aware that the guy who lives next door, his link is to somebody else, and so he has a different value set that takes precedence in his life. And so it could be resolved that way. You've also got the notion in some cultures of a supreme deity, that you may have a pantheon with 36 deities in it, but that particular deity is the king or the queen or whatever the title that attributed to them is. They are like Zeus, the king of the gods. They are the primary one, and therefore that's the primary value, and everything else kind of comes down in a hierarchy underneath that as beings get of slightly lesser status as they go down. So that would in itself be a resolution. Others believe in the notion of, to borrow a term from ceremonial magic, the great work, the idea that all of these gods and goddesses are not in conflict, even though the myths often portray them as having punch-ups and arguments and disputes, whether it's Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Nordic or whatever else mythology. Often they are full of stories about this god having an argument with that god and rubbing each other up the wrong way. But if you take those stories as more metaphorical, and have this kind of great work, bigger picture perspective, you could make the argument that ultimately all of these divine beings work together towards the same unfolding of the universe. And so even if some forces, shall we say, you might be better off keeping a distance apart, just as if you were a chemist, for example, you might know that the chemical in this test tube you should never mix it with the chemical in that test tube, otherwise, boom, it'll go bang. But as long as you keep them in their separate test tubes, it doesn't mean that the same chemicals cannot exist in the same universe. You just don't bring them too close together. Otherwise, you're going to get an explosion or poisonous gas or whatever it is that happens as a consequence of mixing chemical A with chemical B. So you could think of the divine in that sort of way, that this presence and that presence, as long as they are a distance apart, the universe is harmonious. If they come too close together, they don't mix well and disastrous things happen. And likewise, if you go down this Weberian route of associating deities with sets of values that guide human behaviour, you could say that deity encourages that set of values, this deity encourages this set of values, and as long as you don't try and combine them too closely together in a given situation, you'll be okay and society can rub along well, because those people in society over there who worship that god mainly, they can still work well as a larger community with people over here who worship this deity and have these sets of values. It's just that you should never put them in the same room at the same time. Although that's a little bit of a slightly silly way of understanding it, but trying to keep things at a more straightforward level, you could view things in that way, that where you have multiple values rather than one singular value, there could be a hierarchy of this value takes precedence over that value. So if you are in a situation where you can't do both, then you do A rather than B. Or equally, you could argue that certain values for certain types of people, so ethics that work well for a soldier might work less well for a doctor, but that doesn't mean that you can't have both doctors and soldiers with their respective values within the same society, within the same community. You just understand that certain situations require a medical response, other situations require a military response, and the respective ethical codes come into play for each. So it has a nuanced understanding of the complexity of life. Whether it's fully fitting for 21st century life, I suppose, is a slightly other question, in that a lot of these conceptions have come from societies which were not necessarily as convoluted and involved as society becomes these days, with as much role mixing. I just think that often, particularly these days in the 21st century, people frequently have to change jobs and retrain, and they might spend one part of their life being one thing, and then unemployment, redundancy, whatever, comes in and they have to retrain and become something else with a different set of values, whereas maybe earlier periods of time people tended to do one job for life and operated by one set of values for life. They weren't expected as frequently to chop and change as people are expected to chop and change these days. So that's something to mull over as to how the sort of regular changes that take place in the 21st century impact people and their sets of values, and how they make choices and how they operate in life, as they have to kind of almost shapeshift, in a sense, from being one type of person doing one job to becoming a different type of person doing another job. If they're, say, redundancy, unemployment, whatever it is that's necessitated the change. The other element I'm thinking about, again, which is the one I made a can't remember when I did the recording, years and years ago, the notion of worship, which comes from the Anglo-Saxon Weorthscipe, which is a two words joined together, with, to give worth, to give value, to give significance to something or someone, and to recognise the sort of the dignity and respect due to a person or an idea or an object or whatever it is, of a certain type of value, a certain type of significance. And the second part of the ship is where we get to shape in modern English. That can be understood in both active and passive ways, in that you could see that the shaping of worth is that if I value, I value my dog. So in valuing my dog, I feed him, I walk him, I get him medical and veterinary treatment when he needs it, all that sort of business. That shapes his life. If he wasn't valued, if he was just a dog chucked out on the streets, there'd be no one to feed him, he'd be scavenging in bins for food. If he got hit by a car, there'd be no one to provide him with veterinary care, etc., etc. So my valuing him does shape his life in a way that would not happen if he wasn't valued. And so a person who is valued, or a place that is valued, or an idea that is valued, is shaped by the people who do the valuing, in as much as they might look after it, they might treat it in a certain way. If it's a place or an object or a person or an idea, their approach to that object of worth shapes the object of worth. The simple fact that they value it, whereas if nobody valued it, it would be in a different shape. But there's also the sort of the flip side of that, because this is a two-way street, like most things, I think, in, well, I was going to say in paganism, but probably in the world generally, is that not only does the act of valuing shape the object of value, but it also shapes the person expressing the value, that it shapes you. It turns you into a different person because you have this relationship of valuing. Now, again, come back to this hierarchical issue. Very few people in their lives only value one thing. We don't have only one relationship. I'm not talking about romantic relationships necessarily. I'm talking about friendships, family, work colleagues, pets, any kind of relationship. Who goes through their life with only one person that they ever value? No one. I don't think anyone would ever do that. That's not feasible. So you've got friends you value, you've got family you value, you've got pets maybe you value, you've got people you work with that you value, and they come in hierarchies. And you could have put it in a very crude way. You could have the old analogy of the burning house, and you rush into the burning house and there's 5 people needing to be rescued. Who do you rescue first? Do you just grab whoever is physically closest, or do you rescue your child first and then go back for somebody else's child? Do you rescue your sister first or your brother first? Do you rescue your mum first or your dad first? What do you do? What kind of value judgments do you make? I mean, it's a very crude way of putting it, but we value different people in different ways, and so there is a kind of a hierarchy of who do I spend more time with, who do I buy a bigger birthday present for, whatever it is, however it is you express your sense of value for that person. There is a bit of a hierarchy going on there, and it's a shifting hierarchy. The people you value when you're 10 years old are going to be different from the people you value when you're 30 years old, partly because some of them might have died, partly because you'll have met new people, partly because the ways in which you value people and the things you value them for will have changed as you change. And that is, again, this idea of shaping is that that which we value shapes us as well as us shaping them. So if you value, think of abusive relationships, if you value someone who is actually a bit of an arse, who treats you like dirt, but you value them anyway, then you are, well, even if you don't like being treated, let's assume you're not a masochist, you don't like being treated like dirt, but you kind of put up with it through gritted teeth because you value that person. It's turning you into a different kind of a person by what you're prepared to tolerate than if you valued someone who was really loving and kind and caring and didn't treat you like dirt, so you didn't have to put up with anything through gritted teeth. You'd be having a totally different set of experiences in that case. So that which you value changes you. I mean, you might value someone because they're really exciting and wild, especially if you're a teenager or you're young, a bit of a party animal, and so you want to value other people as bits of party kind of party animals. Yes, they're exciting and they're thrilling and they're what have you, but on the day when you fall downstairs and break your leg and need looking after, will they come round and look after you? Well, so they might, but probably not. They're too busy partying and having a wild time. And then you might start valuing people who are more caring and nurturing and a bit more homey, rather than wild party animals, as you realise that other values in life are also important. So it's reflective of the kind of person you aspire to be. I value you, I want to be like you, I want to do the things that you do. So there's a kind of an aspirational element to the giving of worth, the giving of value, the giving of respect and reverence and time and energy and investment and all the things, all the ways in which we show that we value someone. And Weorth is I'd say it's a very active kind of word, in that it's not just some nebulous feeling that you have inside you. Oh, I quite like you. It's a reflection of what you do. It's almost like a verb in the sense that it is predicating action. So if you value a person, an animal, a place, an object, an idea, you do something about it. You don't just have this vague emotional mental state and then sit on your bum and do nothing. It leads you to act. It is a motivational force, the act of valuing, the act of giving worth. And coming back to the hierarchical bit, there might be some things, people, objects, that you value a little bit, that you'll do a little bit of action for, and others that you value massively, that you'll do a massive amount of action for and make all sorts of sacrifices for and investments in them and time and energy and effort. And of course, in the middle, the sort of the medium level valuing and so on. And that changes over life. Again, people you might put a huge amount of effort into when you're 10 could be completely different people that you put a huge amount of effort into when you're 20, 30, 40, 50. And not, I say people, animals, places, objects, a whole slew, and divine figures. The inspirational religious figures that move you when you're 15 could be different from when you're 45, different from when you're 85. As you change, your life changes, and you become responsive to different sets of values that move in and out. So even that kind of hierarchical element could change on a month-by-month basis, a year-by-year basis, maybe even a day-by-day basis, as you gain experiences and your values shift and move and change. So it is the act of giving worth. And I wonder if, without getting too off topic with thinking of psychopathy, sociopathy, various aberrant mental states, there could be people in the world who give very little worth to anyone other than themselves, who are so consumed with their own kind of advanced narcissism that they just cannot be bothered to express value in much of anyone else. Which reminds me a little bit of, what was his name? George Kelly, who was an American, if I remember rightly, I think he was American, psychologist who spoke about the idea of sets of values, and that if, so to speak, all your eggs are in one basket, you put tremendous value on this one thing, and then it blows up, falls apart, then you're devastated because you've got nothing else in your life, no other secondary, tertiary investments. Whereas the individual who has multiple investments, if one element of their life goes down the Swanee, they have other things to keep them going. So if, let's say, someone who falls madly in love and then ditches all their friends and they just obsess over the wife or the husband, whoever it is, and some years later the wife or the husband dies, or dumps them, runs off with somebody else, or whatever happens, the relationship ceases for some reason. Had they had lots of other friends, lots of family members, lots of other people, those other people could have helped them keep going during the bereavement, the grief from the loss. But if they've got rid of everybody else to focus solely on the one and they're gone, there's nothing else in their life for them. And either they've got to rebuild from scratch, or they succumb and go under, because there is nothing else to sustain them. Likewise, people who are workaholics, who invest themselves entirely in a job, and one day they either retire or they get sacked or they're too ill to work anymore or whatever, and then they've got no family, they've got no friends, they've got no hobbies, they've got no nothing. There's nothing else for them. Nothing else that they have valued and invested themselves in, that they have given worth to. And it is that giving of worth to, whether at the purely human level or at the sort of divine mystical level, that is shaping the person who gives worth, as well as shaping the object of worth. Now, coming back to the divine element, that becomes an interesting question, because from a Christian, Muslim, Judaic point of view, the divine is eternal and unchanging, is beyond the capacity of mere humans to influence. So whereas let's say you've got a relationship between two human beings, you could certainly say person A shapes person B and vice versa. It's a two-way street. If it's a relationship between human being and Jesus, or human being and Allah, or human being and many other monotheistic divine figures from other religions, if that figure is eternal and unchanging, it cannot be influenced by the passage of worth. So the worth goes in one direction. The worshipper is shaped by the thing worshipped, but they cannot shape or change the being, the object of their worship, because it's beyond such mere fripperies. Is that necessarily the case in the polytheist religions, in the pagan religions? I don't know. This is one of the issues I'm coming back to, in that it would take a hell of a person to have a significant impact on a divine being. But could we preclude the possibility of it within the polytheist approaches to the cosmos? And I'm not sure that we can. So it allows that possibly, I'm not suggesting it happens every 5 minutes, but possibly the divine could adjust in some capacity in response to the reverence given to it, either by an individual human or by an entire community or entire continent, who focus on that divine being. And we're thinking, well, I say we're thinking, I'm thinking that you can chart historical developments and understand of the understanding of a deity. So the way Hecate was understood 2,500 years ago compared to the way she was understood 2,000 years ago compared to the way she was understood 1,500 years ago has changed. Now, is it that the way people talk about her has changed, or is it she herself has changed? Because it's not absolutely the same thing. A divine force could be eternal and unchanging, and it's just the human beings and what they say about the divine force that changes over the passage of time, not necessarily the force itself that changes. Or it may be that as people change and think differently and adjust and behave differently and engage differently, maybe there is some kind of transformative impact. Possibly not at the absolute divine level, but maybe as we come down within polytheism, as the idea of a hierarchy of beings, ancestral forces, totemic forces, land spirits, etc., etc. So even if the gods themselves are beyond the capacity of change, it wouldn't preclude the possibility that the smaller order of beings could not be changed by that interaction between us mere mortals and them. And I think certainly in some cultures there is the notion of the possibility of change, particularly thinking like the ideas around the angry dead, which crop up in ancient Greek culture, Roman, Chinese, Japanese, big old list of cultures of people who have died under ugly circumstances and become very unhappy and distressed and plague the living. But those cultures often recommend ceremonies and rituals that can be done, often on an annual basis, to help these angry souls, these disconsolate souls, to attain a better place in the afterlife, to kind of resolve their griefs and rages and miseries, and they become potentially more content. So they're not doomed to be angry ghosts for the next 10 million years. They could become better. So there is a notion that even though some things are no longer incarnate, they can still be subject to change, improvement, healing of their wounds, and so on. So there is that perhaps capacity there. The last very brief thing I'll touch on before I go and grab my lunch is not only talking in terms of active and passive, you kind of whether you shape the thing you're worshipping, or it shapes you by the very act of you worshipping it, attributing value to it, attributing worth to it. But also the sense of the sort of internal-external element, in that is this, which is to an extent kind of what Max Weber is arguing, a relatively arbitrary decision on the part of the worshipper. I value X. I think X is tremendously important. So I make the decision to attribute value and time and attention and effort and this and that and the other to the target. Or is it a process of, shall we say, revelation, passive revelation, if we can put it like that? In other words, does X have value? And it's just a case of me realising that it has value. So am I discovering what was always there anyway? Or am I projecting outwards a set of values onto something that previously didn't have value? So does it, fudge, let's go for that, that's a stupid example. I really like fudge. Is fudge innately valuable? Or is it just that I'm a greedy git, and therefore I project my appetites onto fudge, and for me, in my mind, therefore not in the mind of the person who lives next door, but in my mind, it has value. And so we're getting into relativism and a touch of Spinoza. That which is valuable to me would not necessarily, obviously a statement of the blinding the obvious here, is not necessarily going to be a value to some other person, and vice versa. What they value may not be what I value. So is this just, well, in my little mental bubble, this is important, and in your little mental bubble, that's important, and let's just kind of rub along with each other as best we can? Or is this a process where people are discovering the values in the universe that are innate in the universe? And if we come back to the hierarchical issue, if we say that, what can we say? That blue whales are more important than jellyfish. A bit arbitrary. Is it because, in my mind, blue whales are more important than jellyfish, but in somebody else's mind it's the other way around, and we're kind of both right in our own little mental spaces? Because to me this is true, and to you that's true, and although we are disagreeing with each other, we can just say, oh well, never mind, because these truths are subjective. It's all terribly postmodern. Or could we say that in the ecosphere, the blue whale makes objectively more contribution than the jellyfish does, therefore the blue whale does have more value than the jellyfish does, and that woman over there who thinks it's the other way around is just mistaken? And that one day she might come to realise that the blue whale is more important than the jellyfish, which is not to say that jellyfish have no value, that they're worthless and should be abused and ill-treated, etc. Don't know how you'd ill-treat a jellyfish, but anyway. Is there an objective value set, an objective value hierarchy? And we simply come to realise X is more important than Z. Or is it purely arbitrary? a judgment made in the mind of the onlooker, like the old bit about beauty in the eye of the beholder. Is value in the eye of the beholder? Is worth in the eye of the worshipper? Or is it innate to the thing that is worshipped? And there is a recognition, either accurate or inaccurate, of the level of worth that target, that thing, has. I don't know. Because I can see all sorts of arguments stemming out from this one, and it could lead into all sorts of rather dodgy directions, especially if we're starting to think of relative human worth. One human compared to another. Are all humans worth exactly the same as each other? Am I worth precisely the same as I don't know, Mother Teresa on the one hand and Jack the Ripper on the other? Or are human beings, some human beings of greater significance and worth than other, which is an argument that Peter Singer makes, Australian philosopher. And that does lead into, as you can probably guess, some quite dodgy territory when it comes to, well, what do we do about it then? If person A is worth a bit more than person B in some moral capacity, do we treat person A better than we treat person B, etc.? Which gets to some really grim corners if you follow that one down the line. And some of you may have done, or I'll finish in a second, but some of you may have done, there's a sort of like a team building exercise that's sometimes used in different events and activities to try and get people talking to each other, where you have either a lifeboat or a hot air balloon or some other type of a scenario, and it's the usual thing, there's only enough room for X many people and you've got one person too many. Which of these 5 people do you chuck out the air balloon basket, or which of these 5 people do you push off the raft so that the rest can go on? And you have all the way with, is the doctor more important than the engineer? Is the generous millionaire more worthy than the rather tight-fisted poor person? Or all of these kind of arguments. You get given different scenarios with different types of people on the raft or different types of people in the hot air balloon, and you've got to debate who you keep and who you push over the side. And there's no real absolute right answers to these things. It's just a sort of exercise to get people talking and bouncing their ideas around. But you kind of end up going down, potentially you could go down that route in real life, and we certainly do. Coming back to the medical ethics issues, it's a very common scenario in any medical setup, whether NHS or private or whatever. You've only got so much money to go around, you've only got so many resources, and you might well have occasions when you've got more patient demand than you've got the resources to meet the patient demand. And so some people get the medications and the operations and the whatnot that they need, and other people don't. They have to wait a bit longer for the next budget to come around, or whatever it may be. So somebody, a panel of ethicists, doctors, whoever it may be, have got to decide, of these 5 patients, we can only treat 4 of them. Which patient do we make wait for treatment? Which patient do we turn away and say, well, sorry, you can't have your surgery now because we don't have enough resources. We've invested the time and the money and the resources in those 4 people over there. You're going to have to go to the back of the queue and wait for the next time that resources and so forth come available. And those judgments are made on a variety of factors, curability of conditions, age. Do you treat the 5-year-old cancer patient or the 90-year-old cancer patient? That's partly going to be influenced by how long is the patient likely, in as much as you can ever guarantee these things, to live after the treatment. Are you going to be providing one person with an extra 6 months of life, or the other person with an extra 60 years of life? So you're kind of, medical ethicists are having to make these sorts of decisions in the real world all the time, with the comparative valuing of human life, let alone the comparative value of non-human life, animals, trees, etc., where judgment calls have to be made about who gets help and who doesn't, who survives and who doesn't. So we've strayed quite a long way from talking about gods and goddesses and polytheism and monotheism and so on. But these are ideas I'm mulling over at the moment. Be interesting to hear other people's points of view and see if there's certain insights, ideas, things you agree with, disagree with, or things I haven't mentioned at all that you think are worth chucking into the cauldron, mixing up and seeing what you think. Thank you.